Ahoy everyone, and welcome to the season finale of Muskets in Media. We have had a long and fruitful journey throughout multiple games involving muskets, seeing how many game companies use muskets, rifles, pistols, bayonets, and so much more. Video games are some of the craziest things I have seen in my time, here in the modern day. So it felt right to start off with those. But with that being said, we have a very special season finale for you planned. It's time to look at the other media in today's episode. We will be looking at Patriot, a Mel Gibson classic movie about a farmer in the American Revolution leading a group of militia terrorizing the British forces. The story focuses on a farmer named Benjamin Martin, a war veteran from the French and Indian War. War has once again arrived in the United States, 12 years later, as a meeting in South Carolina confirms for us that South Carolina votes to help the colonists fight for independence. This means that the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill has already happened as this movie takes place in 1776. You may be wondering, if the war has technically started already, why is South Carolina voting now about it? Well, that is because each of the states, known as colonies back then, were independent, laying the foundation of how the US sorta works today. Philadelphia and Massachusetts were some of the first states to declare independence against Great Britain. My own home state, New Hampshire, actually voted no to going to war for independence in one of the first meetings for independence. We have to remember that loyalty to the crown was still around. These people were often called loyalists and didn't want to fight Great Britain. Not every American wanted to be independent, thinking they have it pretty good with Great Britain and worried whoever shall lead them after they win will be worse. So we have our setting, let's look at some of our characters. Benjamin Martin, played by Mel Gibson, was a real person, but operated in other parts of the American Revolution, working closer with working on America's non-existent Navy. So while Mel Gibson does have Benjamin Martin's name, the character is truly based off of Francis Marion, who was known as the Swamp Fox, who created one of the most ruthless militias in the American Revolution history, operating out of Snows Island, South Carolina. The Swamp Fox and his militia would harass the British troops throughout the colony, infamously known for striking officers first. During colonial warfare, it had a lot more respect for each side than modern warfare we know now. One of the rules for this warfare was officers should be unharmed. As the movie states, without officers, the battle could be an out-of-control mess.
Now we come to the matter of the specific targeting of officers during engagements. Colonel, you must know that in civilized warfare, officers in the field must not be accorded inappropriate levels of hostile attention.
To your mind, what are appropriate levels of hostile attention?
Oh, Colonel, imagine the utter chaos that would follow from leaderless armies having at each other. There must be gentlemen in command to lead and where necessary, restrain their men.
Restrain them from, say, targeting civilians, women, children, and such.
The American militia were known for not following this rule, doing what was currently called Indian fighting, based on how the Native Americans would fight the British in the French and Indian War. What later became what we now know as guerrilla fighting. Guerrilla warfare is a form of irregular warfare in which small groups of combatants, such as paramilitary personnel, armed civilians, or irregulars, use military tactics including ambushes, sabotages, raids, petty warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and mobility to fight a larger and less mobile traditional military. Perfect for Francis Marion and his militia. So why did they change it to Benjamin Martin? Well, there is a movie reason and a controversial reason. The movie reason is that the Martin had a family, giving him an easy incentive to fight after one of his sons are killed by a cavalry officer, giving the audience something to relate to, protecting family, and giving an easy visual reason for Martin to start his own militia. Here is how good Francis Marion was a militia fighter, and why he was such a great asset to the Americans in the war.
In early 1781, towards the latter half of the Revolutionary War, militia leader Francis Marion and his men were camping on Snows Island, South Carolina, when a British officer made an appearance in order to make a prisoner exchange. As one militiaman recalled years later, a breakfast of sweet potatoes was roasting in the fire, and after the negotiations, Francis Marion, who was commonly known as the Swamp Fox, invited the British soldier to enjoy breakfast with him and his men. According to a legend that grew out of the much-repeated anecdote, the British officer was so inspired by the Americans' resourcefulness and dedication to the cause, despite their lack of adequate provisions, supplies, or proper uniforms, that he promptly switched sides and supported the American independence. Around 1820, John Blake White depicted the scene in an oil painting that now hangs in the United States Capitol. In his version, the primly attired redcoat seems uncomfortable with Commander Marion's ragtag band, who glare at him suspiciously from the shadows of a South Carolina swamp.
The controversial reason is that there are reports that Francis Marion used slaves in his militia and would beat and sexually assault them. This, however, has never been proven in any biography. So I believe because of that speculation they went with Martin, especially when this stupid scene happens.
By standing order of His Majesty King George, all slaves of the American colonies who fight for the crown will be granted their freedom with our victory.
Sir, we're not slaves. We work this land. Freedmen.
Well, then you're freed men who will have the opportunity and the privilege of fighting in the King's army, aren't you?
History buffs covered this already, so I am simply going to say this. We had slaves back then. That is how the times were. We know now that this is morally and ethically wrong. But if you are going to do movies in that time and you choose to show slaves, you can't just simply say they aren't slaves. Both Benjamin and Francis had slaves. Hell, George Washington had slaves and was the first president of the United States of America. It is part of history, and pretending it didn't happen isn't going to help us learn from it. We also get to see famous figures from both sides of the war. Two of them portrayed very well. General Cornwallis coming down to the southern states to take South Carolina particularly. Only thing really wrong is that he talks to General Tavis about expanding past the Appalachian Mountains after the war. This is happening way too soon, as the British actually created the Royal Proclamation Line in 1763, which forbade colonists from moving past the Appalachian Mountains. This was for the natives to keep land past the Appalachian. This is one of the biggest things that angered the Americans into war, as well as taxation without representation. The character of Colonel William Tavington, played by Jason Isaacs, is loosely based on the English cavalry leader Banastre Tarleton, who claims the Times was a dashing officer led by his soldiers. He was no bloodthirsty villain. One small change in the movie, though, the company was known as the Green Dragoons for their uniforms. The filmmakers chose to make those red coats with some green to emphasize that they too were British. With all of our main players in check, let's see their tactics, weapons, armor, and more, and see how the movie portrayed colonial warfare. The scene where Benjamin Martin and his two sons attack the British convoy to save his oldest son is a very historic scene in cinema history, for the way it was shot, showing what the soldiers' point of view, Ben's point of view, and even the two sons' points of view. When the camera focuses on the British point of view, you can see that they are struggling finding these shooters, with Ben dashing between trees and forests, distracting them from his sons taking shots at the soldiers, giving the illusion that it's not just one shooter. It is Ben and his two sons against 20 British soldiers. The weapons you see in the scene are the Brown Bess musket used by the British soldiers, equipped with triangular ring bayonets, a smoothbore weapon, which I actually have a replica of with the bayonet. This weapon is how the British were able to conquer most of the world, as these weapons were quick to load and quick to mass produce. But because of smoothbore, this is where the colonial warfare came from, standing with your soldiers side to side firing a line of bullets down the field. While the running joke with muskets is that these things were not accurate, that is really only true past 80 yards, at least when it came to the Brown Bess, which was enough range for the British line infantry to start landing shots. Benjamin Martin brings his own weapons to this fight as well, bringing 3 more Brown Besses and 1 rifle that was a favorite to all the American militia, the Kentucky Long Rifle. We have talked about rifles before, but this is the most famous one for Americans. Because this was a rifle, meaning it had the grooves in the interior barrel, this thing was able to shoot accurately well over the range of the Brown Bess, 1,600 yards, giving an extreme advantage to the militia using guerrilla tactics. Even though all weapons in this war were firing lead balls, the Kentucky rifle took a lot longer to load, firing only 1 to 2 shots per minute. The last weapon we see in this conflict is the infamous tomahawk, Were tomahawks used in the American Revolution? You can bet your ass they were. The tomahawk eventually became standard equipment for British rifle units and light infantry units deployed to the Americas, including later German riflemen employed by the British to fight in the American Revolution. Benjamin Martin was issued this tomahawk in the French and Indian War, and the weapon continued to be a British standard weapon well up into the 18th century, where the sword became more dominant. Analyzing the fight, we can see Martin starts this fight off with his first shot from a brown bess. The average reload from a brown bess is 20 seconds. I timed this as he reloads the musket after the first shot, and the time I got from 2 shots was 22 seconds, so this is accurate right here. Well done in this part. I am shocked, and if you are wondering, the 2 sons were around the same time, 26 seconds. So the firefight in the ambush scene is extremely accurate. Ben also uses a smoothbore flintlock pistol in this fight. The way he uses it, however, I would start to doubt his incredible accuracy as he runs from tree to tree, fires the pistol, and hits his target from about 30 yards with a pistol. Good fucking luck. The killing of the officers is shown here, and as you can see, the soldiers do not line up in the way to make their weapons more effective. Remember, they don't know how many people are attacking, so getting the most let out evenly is their best chance. After killing over half the line with musket balls, Ben gets in close against the soldiers with a knife and tomahawk. I do question some of these attacks from the British, as they put on their bayonets. This turns your musket into a spear. So why these men thought slashing would be the best with a thrusting weapon, I will never know. Also, where the hell do these 2 come from? They saw everyone get killed and now they show up? These are the dumbest people in the company, I can assure, as the first soldier who charges at Ben with his bayonet gets it taken out of his hands, and then Ben shoots the second guy with the first guy's musket. You're telling me that thing was loaded, and you decided to charge at him? This is why you lost to a bunch of colonists. Greatest military, my ass! The backbone of the American colonists, the first ones to answer the call of liberty, the militia or Minutemen. Why Minutemen, you ask? These civilians would answer the call as fast as possible, most of the time under a minute, hence the name, Minutemen. These soldiers would use guerrilla tactics primarily as these were mostly just civilians who signed up to help the fight. When the American Revolution started, there wasn't an official military for the Americans at the time, hence why the majority of the army, especially in the early stages of the war, didn't have uniforms or training. This would change after the French got involved to help train the new American units. The French wanted to make sure this was a war that they would win before lending military aid. We can see in the film that Martin's militia is trained by the French officer Major Jean Villeneuve. I probably said that completely wrong. In colonial warfare. While this would be the last thing the militia army would want to do, it is important to learn so that you know how the British will fight. Throughout this segment, we see some amazing scenes of guerrilla warfare, hiding in trees, bushes, attacking from what seems out of nowhere. A great example of how militia and Minutemen worked to take on the most powerful military in the world at the time. We see pistols, brown besses, Chevrolet rifles. I see Martin has his Kentucky rifle and a smaller rifle here. Wait a minute, that's a blunderbuss! Well, isn't that interesting? This would be a very uncommon to see in infantry combat, as blunderbusses would be more used in naval combat, as it was more bullets being sent down short range when boarding ships. While it is uncommon, it is not impossible. One final scene we see in all of this is the talk of prisoners and surrendering enemies when it comes to militia. While Martin says that they will take surrendering enemies as prisoners, if hearing how ruthless Francis Marion was, I doubt that this would have happened, and I like to think that this scene is to show that before the other militiamen argue. The last area we will be looking at today will be the final fight in the film. Researching this battle compared to the film, well, I was just kind of left stunned. This is pretty accurate to how the battle went. Well, 2 battles. Let me explain. This battle is mostly based on the Battle of Cowpens, where militia units were the first ones to face the Redcoats and fire 2 shots at the British soldiers, killing 40% of their officers. The militia then retreated from the battlefield, seemingly looking like they are retreating, luring the British into a trap as the British then sent the dragoons to chase the militiamen. The militiamen fell back into line with the main American colonial army and then fired at the dragoon units. After dealing with some British Scots trying to flank the American army, the army was then ordered to do a full bayonet charge at the tired British soldiers who have been fighting for nearly an hour now. The sudden bayonet charge shocked the soldiers so much that they either ran or surrendered on the spot, winning the day for the Americans. George Washington and Tarleton were at this battle, but not in the film. The other battle taking inspiration was the Battle of Guilford, which all they took was the large presence of units, since the Battle of Cowpens was a lot smaller, and they brought Cornwallis in as well. Both battles had this tactic of militia firing and retreating, and both were a victory for the colonists. Besides the movie's big fight of Martin and Tarleton, this fight is shown really well. Except for the big rally scene because of one man waving a flag. Very American. While there is a lot more to cover with this film, and I will tell you right now, there are some scenes we haven't discussed that are completely inaccurate or simply did not happen. Overall, this movie is awesome to me, especially the gunfights, which felt accurate to how they were back then. British soldiers lining up, militia attacking from the shadows, the American army trying to keep up with the British training. It's all very well done. With that being said, I am introducing a new thing for Muskets in media, and that is weapon and warfare accuracy. For this piece of media's Muskets, I give it an accurate depiction of muskets and colonial warfare. The actual story, well, that's a different video for itself. After all of that, we have done it. We have finally finished a whole season of Muskets in media. I just want to say personally to everyone who watched and supported this show, thank you so much for watching. I can't believe we actually did it. I want to give a big shout out to our Season 1 producer, Gaius. Without him, this show would have never gotten off the ground, and I would also like to thank the crew behind the camera for making this possible, Morgier and Tyler. With that being said, I believe Juvie said it's time for me to return to my own timeline. Finally, I get to go home. Juvie! Season 1's finally over!